Scalzi. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm doing a long overdue video that I just haven't had time to make because it's going to be very time consuming for me to film and edit and upload this, and this is my long overdue July wrap-up. Now, I didn't necessarily read more things than average in the month of July. I read 6 books. These just all happen to be books that I have a lot to say about in order to explain my opinions about them. The majority of these were things that I was reading for Hugo voting, and so I was reading them, I think, pretty closely. And every time I think, oh, it's time to film this wrap-up, I look at this list of books and I think, oh my god, I don't have time for this. So I'm going to try to get through all of these. It's probably not going to happen by the time sun sets this evening. I may have to take a break and come back later, but I am determined to plow through. The first book that I read in the month of July was the only book that I read that was not Hugo reading related. It was the only book that I ended up reading for the Because Dragons readathon, which was the first week of July. It hit 3 of the 5 challenges for that readathon, and that is Sorcerer to the Crown by Zen Cho. Now, this is just one of those books that is popular enough in a preferred subgenre of mine, that being historical fantasy, that it was getting increasingly embarrassing that I had not yet read it. This is a Regency fantasy novel with the sort of premise that makes everyone who looks at it say, aha, this is a book for fans of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And everyone who reads it says, don't worry though, it's totally its own unique thing. So I get it. Like, right away the prologue introduces several narrative elements that seem almost directly lifted from Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. But what this is not a dense literary reading experience. This is lighter and fluffier and faster paced. In fact, there's enough sort of like action and excitement in this that I almost hesitate to even call it a fantasy of manners. I would say that Sorcerer to the Crown is derivative of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell in the same way that like your average fast-paced, easy-to-read epic fantasy trilogy in a world with dwarves and elves is derivative of Tolkien. It's a very different reading experience, even if it's modeled on a lot of the same story blocks. So this is a book with 2 main protagonists. The first is a man named Zacharias Wythe. He is the new young Sorcerer Royal who is the head of the Royal Society of Unnatural Philosophers in England. Now, Mr. Wythe is a black man, and as such, he has a lot of enemies who don't believe he has a legitimate claim to being Sorcerer Royal. They blame a falling off in the supply of England's magic on him, and accuse him of foul play in the demise of the previous Sorcerer Royal, who was Zacharias's adoptive father and mentor. So while on the one hand, Zacharias is trying to fend off these challenges to his legitimacy of his claim on his title as Sorcerer Royal, we have our other main character, Prunella. Prunella is also a woman of color. She is mixed race, and she is an orphan. She doesn't really know anything about her parents. And she has been raised by the headmistress of this finishing school for young ladies of high class with magical talents that basically teaches these young ladies how not to use their magical talents because that's improper. Prunella herself has very strong magical gifts, but absolutely no prospects for a future as anything other than a servant, which would be quite a fall in graces for her given that she's essentially been raised alongside all of these noble girls. So when Zacharias ends up giving a lecture at this finishing school, Prunella sees an opportunity for her to move up in the world. She convinces him to take her away with him by telling him that she wants to learn magic, but she's very pragmatic. She knows, in a way that Zacharias doesn't, that the only way that she's going to be able to support herself as a woman in society is not by learning magic. She's going to have to marry rich. So this ends up actually being a pretty fast-paced magical adventure. And at the time I read it, I was very much in the mood for this. I enjoyed it a lot, and I gave it 4 stars. I'm not sure in retrospect it was actually worth all 4 of those stars. I was far less impressed with this on sort of a writing storytelling scale than I thought I would be. There are a number of plot points that feel pretty contrived as the threads of this story start to come together. There's also this thing going on that just annoys me as a narrative device, where from the very beginning, you know that there is something that Zacharias knows that is very important, that you as the reader do not get to know even though he's a point of view character. Specifically something about what actually happened to the previous Sorcerer Royal and his dragon familiar. And that sense throughout the entire book, anytime I was reminded that I didn't know that thing, I felt the annoyance of having information withheld from me. It is one of my pet peeves, and this book really does sort of blatantly shove it in your face in a way that I don't think I would have forgiven had I not been in the mood for something fun, light, fluffy, historical fantasy like this. So I am not totally sure that this book really deserves the full 4-star rating. I gave it, but I do not have the heart to go back and redact that rating and lower it to a 3. That rating was true for me at the time I read it, even if it wasn't totally objective. I'm having the annoying feeling of knowing there are other things I wanted to talk about in my wrap-up of Sorcerer to the Crown when I was reading it, that I just don't have it together to actually talk about right now because I have to move on to other books. Now, the next book I read was on my Kindle from the Hugo voter packet, and that was The Collapsing Empire by John Scalzi, which was one of the Hugo nominees for Best Novel this year. I buddy read this with Joe from Final Blow Joe. It was the first time I'd ever read any Scalzi, and I have to say, I don't think either Joe or I were terribly impressed. There were definitely things I found enjoyable about this book while I was reading it, but what really stands out more to me is the things that annoyed me about it. When Joe did a review of this, it ended up being sort of hilariously scathing, and I'm sort of afraid that mine is going to go in that direction as well, even though I gave this 3 stars. I do want to say I definitely get the appeal of Scalzi. This is very accessible, easy reading, science fiction space opera. I definitely see that there's a huge readership for this. I understand why Scalzi is one of like the most popular currently publishing science fiction authors right now. I just don't see what this is doing with like major awards nominations. Now, this is the first book in a trilogy that is going to be called The Interdependency. The name of the series is the name of the space empire that it concerns. Basically, in this world, the entire known universe that is accessible to humans is ruled by a single imperial government, the Interdependency, and the equivalent of faster than light travel is determined by the pathways of the flow, which is this network of, pathways through space that bring you to, different planetary systems that humans have been able to colonize because the flow goes there. We have imperial government on a planet called Hub that is central to where the streams of the flow converge. The House of Wu rules the empire essentially by religious mandate and maintains power by means of a system where the noble houses are essentially monopolies on various industries. Critically, most of the planets of the Interdependency are incapable of sustaining human civilization without trade because they're not Earth-like inhabitable planets. Hence the interdependency and imperial rule governing it. But what is critically about to change, as the title suggests, the flow is beginning to collapse, and therefore the empire is on the brink of collapse. So for a good deal of the book, we are jumping between two narrative plot lines, one on Hub and one on End, which is this sort of far-flung backwater planet that's constantly experiencing political upheaval. It's the farthest flung in terms of the map of the flow, which is why it is called End, but critically for the, trajectory of the entire series, it is the only truly Earth-like inhabitable planet in the interdependency. On Hub, we have Cardinia, who is a young, unlikely heir to the throne, coming to power upon the death of her father, the Emperox, which is the sort of gender-neutral term for emperor or empress in this world. It's sort of thought that she is going to be a weak Emperox, and she's facing all sorts of political challenges. When she takes the throne, she learns that her father knew of this thing that was maybe going to be happening with the flow. It's still a total secret, but he sent one of his friends off to End to sort of undercover perform scientific research on the flow from End. All the way on End, we have young Lord Mars, who is the scientist son of the guy that Cardinia's father sent to End. He and his father have been studying the flow together, and they have, horrible, damning news. And Mars has to get from End to Hub to warn the Emperox. There is a third main character in this book, and that is Lady Kiva. She is a younger daughter of the noble house that holds the monopoly on citrus. Why is she in this book, you may ask? Well, she is in this book because her spaceship is in the right place at the right time. So, before I go on that track, I'm going to back up a bit. Fundamentally, there are some things going on in this story that, I tend to really like. For example, the trope of a well-intentioned character unexpectedly coming to power and figuring out what to deal with it. That's actually one of the tropes that shows up a lot in fantasy and sci-fi that I'm generally a sucker for. So I was like gung-ho ready to root for Cardinia from the get-go. I also liked Mars a lot as sort of this unlikely hero who has this huge responsibility shoved upon him. But right from the start, there were also things in the way that this story was being told that had me rolling my eyes a bit. I was noticing this tendency for Scalzi to sort of like hit us over the head with all of the necessary information to the point where it felt really unnatural. Like, you have all of these instances where someone is telling Cardinia something that logically you can guess she probably already knows, and it's really there for the reader's benefit. And then you get this scene on End near the beginning where Mars is like literally lecturing a bunch of school-age children in the middle of like a rebellion happening, an armed rebellion happening all around. These school children show up and ask him to give like a lecture on how the flow works, and you're like, I see. This is an excuse to give me a very basic lecture on how the flow works. This is important for the story. It all just felt very blunt. Then we have this thing that bugs me a lot in first books of series, and it's actually something I see a good deal more in YA series than adult. It's this thing where, like, for the first huge section of the story, you've basically got the main characters on a collision course to meet each other, but you're just sort of sitting around and waiting for the characters to meet up so that the real story can, start to happen. And that's how it felt for, like, maybe the first 2/3 of this book, waiting for Mars to actually get to Hub and deliver his message to Cardinia, because that is the whole freaking point. Now back to Kiva and why I didn't like her. So despite the fact that who she is in this story is not particularly thrilling in premise, she's the captain of the ship that's going to take Mars to Hub. Scalzi seems really insistent that Kiva is the character you are going to fall madly in love with. And he does this by making her this, like, stereotypically badass female captain character, but I didn't feel like that characterization actually had any substance. Basically, she just swears a lot. She swears a lot, and she occasionally does really outrageous things because she basically has no moral compass. And you can tell that the effect is supposed to be like, oh my god, awesome, badass lady spaceship captain. But it's all facade and no substance. And there's just a lot of Kiva in this book, and I had no reason to care for her. And that's actually sort of how I felt about a lot of the book. There is plenty going on in this story that kept me turning the pages in excitement, that kept me glued to it until the end. And I can imagine a version of this story that I would be really deeply invested in. But the way Scalzi writes, he sort of skips over a lot of the bits that I really would have wanted in order to become really emotionally invested. Basically, nothing makes it onto the page unless it's pretty exciting plot-wise, and that means that the book is actually pretty short considering how much plot is shoved into it. It's really quite a short book for the start of what seems like an epic space opera series. But a lot of the sort of interactions and character development that I wanted to see didn't happen on the page. There's a lot of time that passes in this book, but you don't get a sense of a lot of time passing because you don't get a sense of how that passing time has affected the characters. Basically, Scalzi never stops for any introspection, and so I never really got any emotional gratification from my investment in the story. For example, right towards the end, no spoilers, but I had basically been waiting for all of the characters to get together and finally, talk everything out. That was what I had been waiting for the entire book. And it happened off the page. Basically, we went straight from everything is in crisis, everything is a catastrophe, oh no, to we have it all figured out, we solved the mystery, we're confronting the villain now, the end. And I was like, what? I needed another chapter in there. I needed that chapter that didn't happen. So this is frustrating for me because I could totally be invested enough in this story to want to see it through once the second and third books in this series are published. But I don't really trust at this point that Scalzi is going to give me the sort of payoff that I'm going to find fulfilling for this storyline. And so I'm kind of content to let the rest of the trilogy be vague headcanon for me. And I don't think I'm going to read the next book in this series when it comes out unless it shows up in next year's Hugo voter packet. I'll say that what The Collapsing Empire really had going for it for me was sheer readability. There are ways in which I feel like this would be just a natural inroad into adult science fiction for, say, a young adult reader who really wanted to jump into reading adult. The length of the book, the pacing, the use of various tropes does feel familiar to me from a lot of YA, and that's why I say that, and that's not a bad thing. But come to think of it, if there is one thing that YA authors in general are not afraid to do, it's to stop and take the time for emotional gratification. And that's what this was missing for me. So I did give The Collapsing Empire 3 stars. It was fun to read while I was reading it, but it wasn't quite for me. I don't think Scalzi is really gonna end up being my author. And I've already been talking for nearly 2 hours here, and I've only covered 2 of the 6 books. I'm gonna take a break. I'll hopefully be back either later tonight or tomorrow to finish filming this wrap-up. Okay, I'm back. And now I'm going to talk about why I really loved In Other Lands by Sarah Rees Brennan. This is a YA fantasy novel. It was one of the nominees this year for the new Not a Hugo YA award that will henceforth be called the Lodestar. I read a copy of this in the Hugo voter packet on my Kindle, and then I purchased a hardcover copy because I needed to have it. Now, this is one of those books where a lot of what I really liked about it is a sort of tone and style that's not going to be for everyone. In fact, it's one of those books where I feel like some of the things I'm going to say about this this book that are like, I loved this about this book, could also be interpreted as like scathing criticisms coming from a different person. So this isn't a book that I'm necessarily recommending broadly to every reader, but I do think this is a book that deserves a good deal more hype than it's gotten, because I do think there are a lot of people who would really, really like this. In Other Lands is a portal fantasy sort of magic school story. It's definitely pulling on and interrogating a lot of those fantasy tropes from portal fantasy, from magic schools, and also some sort of traditional epic fantasy world building things. But the focus isn't really on any of those things. It isn't on the world building. This is completely a character-driven coming-of-age story. This is about a boy named Elliot who lives in England and learns that he is one of a select number of children who can see this wall that divides this world from another land called the Borderlands. And as a human from our world who can enter the Borderlands, he is given the choice to join the Border Guard and essentially enroll in this sort of military training school at the border. And this book takes place over the course of several years, with Elliot going to school in the Borderlands and then returning home to our world every summer. Now, what makes the narrative voice of this book so distinctive is that you are in Elliot's head the entire time, and Elliot is not necessarily a traditionally likable character. He is wildly entertaining to read about. He is ultimately, I think, deeply lovable, but he is not, like, superficially likable. So reading this book is like this overdose of this character that is Elliot, and you really have to be willing to be in that for the long haul. Now, immediately upon arrival in the Borderlands, Elliot meets two of his peers and future classmates. One of them is an elven warrior girl named Serene. In this world, elven society is strictly matriarchal and very sexist towards men in really hilarious ways. And one of the many sort of constant through lines of this book is the sort of clash between human sensibilities and human sexism towards women, and then the elven social structure, which is the complete reverse. But Elliot is immediately certain that Serene is the most awesome person he has ever met, and that she is totally the love of his life. On the other hand, there is Luke Sunborn, the handsome golden-haired jock and obvious future warrior hero of the legendary Sunborn clan. Now, Elliot, being the precocious little nerd that he is pretty sure he knows this type, and he is pretty sure that Luke is going to be his arch nemesis. Now, Elliot, as it turns out, is totally wrong on both of these counts about both of these people, but it takes him a really long time to figure that out. Meanwhile, Elliot is very strongly opinionated about everything to do with this fantasy land that he's found himself in. It is entirely underwhelming, for example, that this is a world that does not seem to have any actual magic. It just lacks modern technology. Always winter, never central heating is a line that will stick with me for a long time. But furthermore, it's a very warlike land, and it values its warrior heroes, and there's all this conflict between all of its factions. There are the humans and the elves and the dwarves, but also, like, there are some dryads that show up in the book. There are harpies, and Elliot really, really, really wants to see the mermaids, despite the fact that he is repeatedly told that the mermaids will kill you. But there's all of this, like, military conflict, and the Border Guard is essentially a military operation. The school he's going to is basically a military school, and Elliot is a pacifist. And Elliot is elected to follow the council training course, which is basically the study track in diplomacy as opposed to the war training course, which his friends are in. And the council training students are, like, definitely second-class citizens. The council is not really allowed to do anything except rubber stamp poorly written treaties that are written by people without council training. And Elliot, the bookish nerd that he is pretty certain that his diplomacy skills and his study of the peoples of the Borderlands and their customs would help him bring peace to the Borderlands if only anyone would let him. But despite the sense instilled upon him from reading portal fantasy novels, that if you are from the real world and you travel to a fantasy world, you are necessarily somehow going to be the hero of that story, Elliot isn't really the hero character here. He finds himself being more of a sidekick, the sort of third wheel to Serene and Luke, who are becoming these, like, absolutely legendary warriors. And I'd say that while this is a very humorous book, and it started out for me feeling pretty strictly comedic, it does get very, very emotionally raw. As Elliot, year after year, deciding if he's going to return to this school and this people, is wondering if, like, he really has a place there, if he's really needed, or if he would be better off, like, catching up on his high school so he could go to college in the real world. And in terms of the structure of the book, there's sort of this emotional whiplash going on throughout the whole thing, where you're in some sort of very comedic situation, and then suddenly it gets very, very, very serious for a while, and then once you're sort of used to the fact that we're dealing with all these serious themes, we're back to something that seems so much more mundane. Over the course of this book, Elliot has to watch his friends and classmates, like, actually go off to war and kill people and risk getting killed. And he is totally right to think that his teenage classmates are way too young to have to do this. The sort of fantasy world standard here that of course our teenage heroes will lead us is horrific. And he sees that, but he also doesn't know how to be supportive of his friends while voicing that criticism, and he comes off as a jerk. There are so many times here where Elliot is fundamentally right, but he goes about it in totally the wrong way. Like, there's a scene early in the book where the students are going to be learning knife throwing. And so Elliot, in protest, grabs the basket of knives and starts throwing them around willy-nilly, saying this is why it's a terrible idea to teach 13-year-olds how to throw knives, and he's right, but like, oh my god, Elliot, stop. And then the other major thing that's going on here that really distinguishes this book, in my mind, from the vast majority of young adult fantasy is the romance storyline and how Elliot's quest for love is treated over the course of this story. Because for all that this is about, you know, warring factions in a fantasy world, it is a character story, and the emotional arc and the character growth in it is centered around Elliot trying to figure out romantic relationships. And there is a tendency, I think, in young adult fiction for the romance storylines to essentially function as teenage wish fulfillment. And I see why that sells. I frequently enjoy those stories myself, but rare is the YA fantasy book that actually sort of takes those relationships down off of that pedestal and really interrogates, like, what does it take for a romantic relationship to work, and focuses on a teenager who, like, gets it wrong several times before getting it right. And Elliot is trying really hard at the relationships he pursues over the course of this book, but he still gets it so wrong. Like, I'm trying to think of the last YA fantasy novel I read that had a breakup in it, and I cannot think of one. And when you think about it that way, like, the genre is sort of doing teens a disservice. And Elliot, despite being an obnoxious character a lot of the time and really oblivious to a lot of the things that are going on with the people in his life, he's an intelligent kid, and he definitely takes really nuanced lessons away from each of these experiences he has. It should be noted that Elliot is bisexual, although it takes a while in the book for that to be revealed, and that really is a big part of the story. At Worldcon, I saw 2 different panels that this author was on, and she mentioned the sort of portal fantasy nature of the book with a character who goes back and forth between 2 worlds as being a sort of heavy-handed metaphor for a character who is wrestling with his own bisexuality. And in both cases, both halves are very much part of his identity, and he's wrestling with life choices, both like where does he want to spend his life and what cause does he want to dedicate it to, and what person does he want to commit to building a relationship with. And with regards to the romance and really all of his interpersonal relationships, Elliot is so bad at it because it turns out he's never really had love modeled for him in his home life. Like, Elliot's father is a complete garbage human being, and I vehemently want to throw him out a window. And basically this book made me very, very emotional. It has been a really long time since I had a reading experience with a book that made me feel this many things, made me laugh this much, made me this close to tears. The writing of this book is probably not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but it is incredibly quote-worthy. There are both lots of laugh out loud great lines and lots of passages that are really deeply thought-provoking. And that's because Elliot is this messy, intelligent, horrible person, and you are stuck with him through the highs and the lows. Now, reading this book occasionally, it did feel that it was over long. I do have a tendency to be really fond of books that ramble, so I don't really hold it against it, but the reading experience of this is sort of slow and long and all over the place. In terms of page count, this is 400 something pages long, 437, which isn't that long for a YA book, but the way that this is written, it does feel like a long book, and I think this is more text per page than is standard for YA. And the scenes do cut very quickly from things that are tonally more lighthearted and tonally very serious. There is an episode, for example, where, like, all of a sudden, the students are working on the school play. And it's an elven play because there are more roles for women in elven plays. And much to Elliot's dismay, the only two male roles are the ingenue and the slut. And oh my gosh, I totally identify so hard with everything about this scenario. But basically it's like all of a sudden your Portal Fantasy story turned into High School Musical and everyone's kissing the wrong people on stage. And then you turn the page and the next thing you know, oh my gosh, we're off to war again. So my hope is that I'm giving you enough of a sense of how this book reads that you will either know this is totally for me, or you can say maybe this will be a pass for me on this one. Basically, it is structurally messy. It is about a character who is emotionally messy. I cannot tell you how many times I wanted to shake Elliot and tell him, you've got this totally wrong and you are hurting people because of it. And yet I simultaneously felt that if a certain couple didn't get together by the end of the book, I was going to throw my Kindle across the room. All the feels, I am telling you, all the feels. And purely because it has been a long time since I have had this many feels with a book, and honestly, I like big, sloppy, ambitious storytelling. I gave this book 5 stars. So now I'm really curious about Sarah Rees Brennan as an author. Prior to this book, the things she's written are not things that I would have thought I would have had any interest in. She's mostly known as a paranormal YA urban fantasy author. Like, she has published stories in like the multi-author collections in Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunter universe, and like I get the sense that her own series have been sort of that same subgenre, and that's just not something I usually pay attention to. But now I am definitely wondering if I have misjudged based on, you know, subgenre preconceptions. If you've read anything else by Sarah Rees Brennan, please let me know what you think. This book itself is a very interesting origin story. It started out as a short story that she was publishing online, and then eventually it got long enough that someone pointed out to her this really needs to be a novel. But yeah, I'm definitely very curious about Sarah Rees Brennan's other books now. Next, I read Raven Stratagem by Yoon Lee, which is the second book in the Machineries of Empire series, the first of which was Nine Fox Gambit. I read this also in the Hugo voter packet. This was one of the nominees in the best novel category. And this one I'm actually not going to say a whole ton about because it's one of those sequels that it's very hard to say much about without spoilers for book one. But basically, if you've already read the first book, you will have made it past that hurdle of figuring out what the heck the world of this series even is. You have a space empire called the Hexarchate that's ruled by 6 factions that have different skill sets, and it's a world where observance and adherence to a government's high calendar, which dictates a lot of things about a way of life, because of fancy mathematics, makes certain technologies, including military technologies, possible. What we had in the first book was basically a scenario where the main character, who was a captain named Cheris, became the anchor for the resurrected consciousness of a dead general from a different faction who is considered a madman and has a deadly past, and that is Jadao. If you'll recall, the basic summary of what I said about my feelings regarding the first book was that I sort of felt like it was pretty obvious from the beginning that the entire premise of this military regime that is literally dependent on groupthink is inherently tyrannical, and a lot of the plot of that first book was sort of a distraction from where that was eventually going to lead us. I liked Raven Stratagem better because I feel like there are just so many more balls in the air by this point in the series that you're trying to track, and there are enough of them now that you can't keep track of them all. There's like this thing about immortality that came up maybe at the beginning of the first book, and of course I should have remembered that was going to be important. There is all of this internal politics with the hexarchs of the different factions, and in the meantime, the whole book you basically know that the situation with Cheris and Jadao is not as it's being presented to you, but you don't know what the situation actually is, and it will keep you sort of guessing. One of the things that felt a little weaker to me than the first book, though, was that some of the main characters, specifically the character from whose perspective you're seeing the Cheris-Jadao situation, like, she was not a memorable character for me at all. I don't even remember her name, and she was, like, probably the most significant point of view character in the book, but I did really like the sense that there's a lot of big picture stuff to be paying attention to, and also the sense that even while all these big things are going on, Yoon Lee makes this world feel very inhabited by real people. There's a vast array of cultures within the Hexarchate, and we see a lot of those details in the variety of people that come and go throughout this story, and it makes this world feel big and varied and interesting. The title, Raven Stratagem, is a reference to Cheris's home city, the city of Raven's Feasting, I think it's called, and she is from one of these minor ethnic groups that becomes an important plot point in this story. And you also get a lot of different perspectives from all of these military characters of like where they come from and what brought them here in life. And I really do enjoy that about this series because I think it really grounds something that is mostly sort of big picture theoretical. So that's my sort of rambly reasoning as to why I gave Raven Stratagem 4 stars, which is higher than Nine Fox Gambit. Nine Fox Gambit was an optimistic 3-star rating for me. I am not frequently drawn to the ideas and themes of military science fiction, but so far this series is basically working for me, and I'm totally going to be reading the third book. I have it on hold from the library right now. Okay, I am back once again with only 2 more books to talk about in this wrap-up, and this should be relatively quick. The next book I have to talk about is Akata Warrior by Nnedi Okorafor. This was one of the nominees in the YA Not a Hugo Award category. This is the book that won that award this year. This is the sequel to Akata Witch, and the way this book sort of goes and wraps up, I would assume there are going to be more books in this series, though they aren't officially announced yet. This series is about a girl named Sunny. She's a young teenager at this point. She's from a Nigerian family. She was born in America, but her family is living in Nigeria again, and she's also albino. And then in the first book, she learns that she has magical abilities and is therefore what is called a leopard person, but she's a so-called free agent because she doesn't come from a family of leopard people. And so her group of friends are basically the people that she's being introduced into leopard society with, and she has to keep that secret from her family. I'd say that this sequel felt like it had a few sort of really distinct things going on in it. And I didn't dislike any of them, but strangely I sort of thought that the main plot line, the main sort of conflict arc of the book, was the least interesting aspect of it. Sunny now has a mentor in Leopard Knox who she's studying under, but there's some turmoil that arises, and eventually Sunny and her friends essentially have to run away to try to find this magical city called Osisi, where there's a second confrontation with an evil masquerade from the first book. That's essentially the main plot, but it's not all that substantial, and it didn't make a ton of a lot of sense to me as the next step in this story. What's more interesting are several things that are going on with Sunny in this book. First, her relationship with her brothers has developed immensely from the first book, and she's shown as being much closer with them, and specifically, her oldest brother in this book goes away to college, and he gets dragged into some really deeply scary social stuff, and he's in a lot of trouble, and Sunny has to decide if there's anything she can do as a leopard person to help him, given that no one in the mundane world is supposed to know anything about the magical world, so she can't reveal herself. And what happens there sort of redefines her relationship with some family members, and there's also sort of this running theme of examining, like, what is leopard society's responsibility towards the normal human world. Both how what is coming from the magical world that is bad can cause distress and problems in the regular world, and then also what is the responsibility of people who are fighting for good. What do they do to fight that battle for good in the world? Also, sort of within Sunny, her internal conflict, something happens in this book that drastically changes her relationship with her spirit face, which is like her inner spirit identity that is immortal and has had many lives before her, but she doesn't necessarily have any memory of what her spirit face's previous existences were. She just knows that she's considered somewhat important by certain magical entities because her spirit face is one that is recognized. And Sunny's relationship with her spirit face changes in this book, and there's sort of an emotional journey of her figuring out what that means for her own confidence and identity. This series is sort of framed by this idea that Sunny's first experience of magic was seeing a vision in a candle flame of the end of the world, and the sort of inevitability of the end of the world and how that knowledge hangs over her. And I don't necessarily think there was much forward progress in understanding what that's all about in this volume in the series, but it is still there. So yeah, I'd say that while this book doesn't end in a literal cliffhanger, this episode of Sunny's story is wrapped up, I do feel like it sort of ends on a bunch of thematic cliffhangers. There's a lot of stuff that hasn't been fully explored yet. So I gave this book 4 stars. I'm not displeased that it won, but it wasn't the most memorable standout book for me. And then the last book in this wrap-up is one that I also enjoyed quite a lot, although maybe not quite as much as I was expecting to, given that I had this so highly recommended to me from so many different people. I really did enjoy this, and I will be continuing with the series, but it's not like my new favorite book ever, and that is The Curse of Chalion by Lois McMaster Bujold. This is the first book in the World of the Five Gods series, which did in fact win the Best Series category this year. There's a trilogy of novels and a series of novellas in this world. This is the first of the novels. It was the first published. This is where I started. This is about a man named Kazaril. And I've had to say that a couple of times because the first few times it came out sounding a little like casserole. Which did not occur to me at all when I was reading it on the page, but whoops. But Kazaril is a man who has had a pretty highly respected military career in this relatively traditional fantasy world. But at the end of a siege that ended badly some time ago, he was not ransomed with the rest of his officers, and so he ended up getting sold into slavery to be a galley slave. And now, sometime later, he has escaped. But he is much changed by the experience, much degraded. He has nothing and nowhere to go, so he makes his way at the beginning of the book on foot to an estate where he worked in his youth, and he thinks that the ruling lady there might give him a job. He wants to stay very under the radar and have some sort of like humble living because he's pretty sure he has enemies in high places, and he's probably better off if those people think that he is dead. But he ends up becoming the secretary tutor, basically the mentor, to this young princess, or the term in this book is royess, named Iselle. And Iselle is a very bright, somewhat impulsive young woman, but I think in a sort of more traditional telling of a story like this, Iselle might have been the protagonist, because she's a very strong but young and naive female character. And she also has a lady-in-waiting character, I don't remember if that's the correct title, but who is also a really great character. But Iselle, being a princess, is inevitably going to be pulled into some very big games. A lot of people want to use her as a pawn, and Kazaril is basically teaching Iselle how to be a player in these political games instead of a pawn, while also trying to evade the notice of his enemies. Now, Kazaril is a really likable protagonist character. I've heard him described as sort of an older fantasy protagonist. He's not that old. He's like 35. He is aged beyond his years by his life experiences, but he's not actually old. But he's fundamentally a good, selfless person. And that's very likable about him. There is magic in this book, but it isn't the sort of book where, like, people have magic and, like, people use magic. The magic in this book is very theologically tied to the religion and the gods of this world. This is the world of the 5 gods. There are 5 gods, 4 of them for the 4 different seasons, and then one sort of dark god called the Bastard. And as the book progresses, more and more of that magic that comes with that religion comes into the story. There is some stuff that's pretty central to the plot that has to do with, like, what happens to, you know, people's souls when they die. And so that also leads to, like, some sort of supernatural ghost stuff that is just, it's never my favorite thing in a fantasy magic system, but I'm not docking, like, super extra points off this for it or anything. There's also some question of, like, destiny, and, you know, whether or not the events of Kazaril's life have been in service of some destiny. And that is also not my favorite fantasy trope, but also, like, I live with it. Both that and the supernatural stuff basically work for me here because it's all framed within this theological context that's actually very, very interesting that I liked. But it did end up dabbling in some fantasy tropes that aren't my favorite thing ever. Nevertheless, I really did enjoy this book. I enjoyed the characters a lot. I find the world that it's set in very interesting, and I do look forward to continuing on with this series. I gave this book 4 stars. So these were some of the books I talked about today for this belated July wrap-up. Today, over the course of 3 days, I have filmed this video. 3 days. There was one more book that I technically read in the month of July that was my first Booktubeathon book. Booktubeathon started at the end of July and then went through the beginning of August. I'll be doing a separate Booktubeathon wrap-up though. And then there were also a couple of ebooks in this wrap-up that I don't have print copies of here. But if you have read any of these books and you would like to discuss them with me, please leave a comment below. If you're interested in reading them, if you have any questions, I look forward to hearing from you. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.